Hey, welcome to Biblical Worldview. I just want to record a short video really laying out this whole gender ideology, gender identity ideology. They teach kids that you are genderqueer, that you're neither male nor female. You're not male if you're not G.I. Joe. You're not female if you're not Barbie. They teach them these things, and then they show in a survey that there's all these genderqueer kids. There's all these trans kids in our school who have a very high suicide rate. They need services. They need to be affirmed. And if we're not doing that, we're not serving our children. And then the services then create more genderqueer kids. It's a never-ending cycle, and it's destroying the lives of our kids. And I can prove it. The American Psychiatric Association, the APA, in their last edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, they predict 70 boys and 15 girls out of 1 million children surveyed. So out of 500,000 boys, 70 boys would have diagnosable gender dysphoria, which is actually very easy to diagnose if you look at the criteria I shared in my last video. 70 boys and 15 girls. That's about a 5-to-1 boy to girl ratio of genuine gender dysphoria. So if you look at those numbers, if you take an average school of 1,000 students, and I like statistics and I like looking at the data and seeing what it says. In an average school of 1,000 students, you would get one girl with genuine gender dysphoria per 33 schools. That's one girl in just out of 33 schools, just one. So it'd be very unusual to find one school with one genuine person with gender dysphoria. Now, a person with gender dysphoria means they're struggling with their gender identity or they're dissatisfied in some way. It doesn't mean they're automatically trans or they're automatically the opposite sex or gender. That is just taught to them by this nonsense, ridiculous ideology. It's very, very rare. A chance is 1 in 33 that any particular school would just have one girl with gender dysphoria. And now if you extrapolate this out, because we're seeing large groups of girls and boys, but it's mostly affecting girls. You could read Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. The chances of 2 people in any one school at 2 girls would be 1 in 1,089. The chances of 3, because you just multiply the probabilities, in one school would be 1 in 36,000. 5 would be 1 in 39 million in one school if there's no other factors involved. So where are all these, how are there dozens of kids coming out as genderqueer in schools? Where is this coming from? Well, let's look at several possibilities. You tell me. No, you don't have to tell me. It's very obvious which of these is true. The first is these numbers have always been this high, but kids have been afraid to come out. Now that there's affirmation for the trans identity, now that there's affirmation for gender nonconforming, genderqueer kids, now kids are they feel safe. And so the numbers have always been there, but now it's just coming out. Well, you and I know, if you're my age, you know there were not kids in our school, maybe one. You know, there were kids that were gay, there were kids that were lesbians, but there were not kids that were the opposite gender. So let's look at the problem with this. First, gender dysphoria is associated with a high risk of suicidality. It's associated with a high rate of suicidality, and it's supposed to be because there's a lack of affirmation. Of course, there are no long-term studies that demonstrate, that isolate the variable of gender dysphoria as leading to the high suicide rate. But if that's true, where are all the suicides before when there was zero affirmation? Now children are being affirmed. They're being celebrated when they're genderqueer, when they're trans. Where are the thousands? There would be like dozens of suicides in every school every year in the past when kids have not been affirmed and they've had to suppress this identity that they supposedly have had all this time. It doesn't make sense. Second, if the prevalence is truly as high as we're seeing now, where are all the adults who have been suppressing their trans identity for decades coming out now that they are affirmed? I mean, there's a few. There's Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner, Zoe Tur. There's a few here and there which are actually men with autogynephilia, which is a separate thing. And it can't account for the inversion of boys versus girls with gender dysphoria. In other words, If it was a 5-to-1 boy to girl ratio with gender dysphoria, why is it suddenly almost the reverse of that now? All right, so that's one possibility. Remember, number one, well, I'll put it on your screen. These numbers have always been there, but now students feel safe to come out. That makes no sense, but that is the only explanation that they can give. Number two, and I'm going to say it's numbers 2 through 7. All the other explanations combined make far more sense. Any of these, but all of these combined show it. Number two is there is a social contagion involved. Students are psychologically encouraged to be anything other than cis heteronormative. In other words, if you're cis, it means you're a man who identifies as a man or a woman who identifies as a woman. I do not recommend using that label. If you're a man, you're a man. If you're a woman, you're a woman. There's no need to put a prefix with it. It already means what it means. But there's a social pressure to not be cis heteronormative, to be something different, to be queer, to be odd. They get cool points for being queer in some way. This is inadequate. And, you know, the whole oppression hierarchy, if you're trans, you're at the top. You're like the most oppressed, which doesn't make any sense because it's just not true. You're celebrated. You could get a YouTube channel, make millions of dollars like Dylan Mulvaney. Anyway, it's an adequate explanation for how whole friend groups suddenly realize they are non-binary, pansexual, trans, any of those things. You get whole groups of friends because there's a social contagion and they come out all at the same time. That's what people are seeing. And then they get celebrated for coming out at an age when they're discovering their identity and teenagers crave a sense of belonging. Being genderqueer in some way gives you instant acceptance and a place to belong. And you see this also with kids developing supposedly Tourette's or dissociative identity disorder. Some of you think of it as multiple personality disorder, where they'll go and make TikToks and they'll be like ticking and they'll be making it up because they're picking it up. There's a contagious aspect of this, especially in the teenage years when their brains are developing and they're very highly suggestible. So that's the second option. There's a social contagion involved. That is already far more obvious than the first option. Number three, they are conditioned from a younger age to think that gender identity is completely disconnected from sex. They're taught this in elementary school and middle school. They're given this, they're given books and things that support this ideology. They use the term sex assigned at birth. They're given little helpful aids like the genderbread man or the gender unicorn or the gender spectrum. That's, well, I can't call it my favorite, to really screw up their minds and think that gender is so many more things than sex. And remember, you could go to my last video, gender is completely fabricated. It's not a real thing. Even they say, oh, well, sex is biological and gender is a social construct. And then they say, well, no, sex isn't biological. It's not binary. Actually, biologists refute the idea that sex is on a binary, either male or female. Well, if they do, they're wrong. Science is science. Anyway, I thought they believed science is real. But at a very young and suggestible age, they're brainwashed into thinking that you don't have to be male or female. You're not male or female. You can be anything along this wonderful binary, and that these alternative identities are to be celebrated. And this idea is planted in their head that they're actually somehow superior. And this conditioning is commonly called grooming. For girls especially, this is the next option, number 4. For girls especially, puberty is an extremely challenging and uncomfortable time. And this is a huge reason why this is impacting girls far more than boys now. Where they grow breasts, they have a period, and all the associated grossness of being an adolescent female. It's uncomfortable. There's a lot of challenges with it. Imagine being told all of that, all the pain, all the cramps, the periods, the breasts, like boys looking at you in a certain way. All of that could go away by just being a boy, and you could be a boy. You don't have to be a girl after all. You don't have to have periods. Or maybe they were exposed to degrading porn and they thought, man, this is what it means to be a girl or woman. I want none of this. In any case, there's a sense of internalized misogyny or internalized disgust or hatred of being a woman, and that can be a powerful psychological factor. Number 5, Many of these young women have, or even young men have same-sex attraction, and they identify as gay or lesbian, and they may have come out that way. And I'm not making any judgment on this in this video. That's not the point of it. They may be either a more effeminate male, they may be a more masculine female, maybe they're a female, what used to be called a tomboy, and they like to be called climb trees and play softball and sports and things like that, or a boy who likes more what we would call feminine things. Anyway, rather than simply assuming that maybe they're gay or lesbian, or maybe they're just a little more effeminate and they like other things, they're not G.I. Joe or Barbie on that gender spectrum, they're told they're not actually not the gender that they were born as. The next one is there's an explosion of social media dedicated to walking the children down the path of questioning their own sex. So if their kids are on social media, they're seeing TikToks, they're on Tumblr and reading blogs and seeing things where there's groomers and activists that are going after children and starting to brainwash them into this cult. Walking down, they're teaching them to question their own biological sex, how to talk to their parents, and how to talk to their doctors about it to get puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then ultimately surgeries. And there are no roadblocks in place to stop children. Therapists have to affirm it's illegal to even question it. And they equate it somehow with conversion therapy of gay or lesbian people and try to make it sound like the same thing. It's a completely different thing. Any therapist who sees some kid come in and say, oh, I'm trans or I have gender dysphoria, well, they should realize the chances of that being true and them actually having it are, what, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million. 1 in 100,000. I mean, it's vanishingly rare. It is very unlikely then for that child coming in to actually have gender dysphoria. If they give them a survey to try to find out if they actually have it, the kids have been conditioned how to answer those questions. They're not allowed to look into other things, other factors that are involved in this. Do you have depression? Do you have autism? Do you have anorexia? Those are all very high comorbidities along with gender dysphoria. That's the therapist's job, is to dig into this. And then rather than like saying, well, let's take a look at this, let's understand that 85 to 95% of children with gender dysphoria grow out of it by the time they either hit puberty or and far more by the time puberty completes. So let's sit back and watch. No, right away we need to put them on puberty blockers, then cross-sex hormones, and then surgeries. I mean, it is insane. I mean, people on the left used to be afraid of pharmaceutical companies or distrustful of them and the medical industrial complex, and now we're just throwing children right into it as they make billions of dollars off of the lives of children getting irreversible damage to their bodies. So there's an explosion of social media dedicating to walking children down the path of questioning their own sex, how to talk to their parents and doctors about it to get these puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries without realizing and having the ability to understand what the long-term consequences of these things are. Kids cannot consent because they are unable to understand the long-term consequences of having no breasts, of having their genitals changed, of being a lifelong medical patient on testosterone, of never being able to have children. They don't understand what that is like. All they are done is they're fed all the positives of what this will do for their lives while ignoring all the harms. And then the seventh one, I already talked about it. There's just a high comorbidity between gender dysphoria and autism, anorexia, depression, and many other disorders. Why aren't we looking at all these other factors? And we're just assigning it to one thing because we are in the grips of an evil, wicked, insidious ideology that doesn't truly care about our children, that just wants to destroy their lives, and it's ultimately a Marxist agenda. It's to create people that have problems and oppression points, and to queer everything. That's basically their goal, to overthrow everything that is normal, normative, traditional. And so why does this survey exist? Why is my son and everyone's children in these public schools where I live being forced to take this survey? And these surveys are going on in schools all over the country, even at younger ages, because they want to create, it's a supply and demand thing. If they teach, oh, if you're not, imagine a child, they're being taught, well, if you're not G.I. Joe and you're not Barbie, you're somewhere in the middle. That means you're not a man or a woman. You're somewhere on the gender spectrum. That means you're gender queer. They teach the kids this, then they give them a survey asking if you're gender queer, and they get 100 out of 1,000, whatever it is, kids saying they're gender queer. And then they go to the administration of the schools, they go to the board of the schools, and they're like, look, these kids, like 50% of these kids are going to kill themselves if they're not affirmed. We need more services. We need more power. We need more activities and things to help support these kids. We need more money. And then they infiltrate the schools even more. They create more and they groom more kids that are going to think that they're trans or some other gender than they actually are. And then they get more services and more power. It's all a game about gaining more power. All right, so I think it's very obvious that the first option for this is that these kids have always been around, but they've been not felt safe to come out, is a complete lie that's proven wrong for the reasons I've already shared. It's far more sensible that there is social contagion involved, that they're conditioned from a very young age now in schools by the books that they're given and the way teachers are teaching things because they've been taught this in the schools of education. They're conditioned to think that gender identity is disconnected from biological sex and you can be whatever you feel like, it's something else. Puberty for girls is a very strong reason why they're taught they don't have to go through that. Many have same-sex attraction, or they're more masculine females or more feminine men. That doesn't mean they're not male men or they're not women just because they're on this spectrum of masculinity or femininity. We all are. Everyone is. But instead of being gay or whatever, they must be trans. You're not a gay boy, you must be a girl. It's anti-LGB. The explosion of social media that kids are having access to that are reinforcing these things. And then the high comorbidity between gender dysphoria and autism, anorexia, depression, and many other disorders. So the final thing I want to say is that if suicide and suicidal ideation, imagine there being a very high correlation. Imagine that it's true, and it's not. That 50% of trans kids are going to commit suicide if they're not affirmed. Just imagine that's true without any other comorbidities. If that's true, why on earth would you want to teach kids at a very young age that they might be trans? You would want to do everything you could to prevent that, to not plant that idea in their heads if it's going to lead to very high rates of suicide. But no, this is insane. We shouldn't teach children that gender identity even exists. It's not a thing. It was invented in the 50s. And that we shouldn't teach them that it's disconnected from biological sex. We shouldn't teach them that they can be whatever they want because they cannot. It's just that that's a fact. Why would we plant and push young people toward gender confusion and dysphoria if this was true, if the suicide rates were that high? You'd think we want to prevent that if we were serious about preventing the suicide epidemic. And we'd expect the suicide rate then to go down as affirmation becomes far more common. I shared this and demonstrated this in my last video. Thank you for watching. Please share this. We need to save our children. God bless you. Bye.